Great. Thank you so much, Tim, and good morning, everybody. Great to see you guys. A year ago, I sat down with our dog, Maisie, and had what turned out to be an important conversation with her. You see, all through Maisie's life, up until this conversation, she had lived in an urban metropolis. In central London, in a major capital city, Maisie's life had mostly been in a mid-terrace London house where when we opened the back door to the garden and Maisie was encouraged to run in the garden was so small that it must have seemed to her like a prison courtyard. For a treat, Maisie, if she was good, was allowed to walk up our street, cross the busy road, and enter the cemetery, where, if she was good, we let her look at the squirrels and read the tombstones, the gravestones of dead dog owners. But I was telling Maisie that I was going to take her away from all this. I was going to take her to the promised land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the countryside, to a wonderful place called Camberley. And there I promised her she'd be able to roam for miles in the countryside and play and frolic with the other animals that live in the countryside, with deer and other animals that probably live in the countryside like lions and tigers and bears and such like, in one big sort of happy animal family. And Maisie looked back at me with an expression that said, "This all sounds too good to be true." And I think that in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, that it's almost as if Moses is reacting to God saying that the Hebrews will be free, that they'll go to the promised land, that they'll be in a land flowing with milk and honey, almost like, this all sounds too good to be true. God said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever and ever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel, and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what's been done to you in Egypt, and I promise to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. So it really will happen. Verse 20 is really important. This is not just talk, Moses. The Hebrews really will be free. Now, kind of raises the question, what was it that God wanted them to do in the promised land that God presumably felt that they couldn't do while they were slaves in Egypt? And the answer is that God wanted them to be a missionary nation, a kingdom of priests. Priests are people who represent God to the world. God's plan was that his people would be like a showroom, a showcase that show the world how great the Creator really is. God is revealing himself to his creation through maybe by flying a plane in the sky with "Hello, I'm God." No, he's going to do it through a missionary nation living on the planet that people can look at and see how good God really is. That's the plan. "And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed." Oh, that's curious. I wonder what that's all about. Oh, hang on, we find out. "Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians." Now, this last bit, I mean, the whole thing is hard to believe, but this last bit must have really strained credulity, don't you think? I mean, what's God saying to Moses here? That what's really going to happen is there are Mr. and Mrs. Egyptian, the slave owners, and there are Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew slave, the slaves, and Mrs. Hebrew slave is going to walk into the bedroom of her Egyptian mistress, who's there with her jewelry box, with her gold earrings, her gold necklace, her gold, what's that thing called? Amulet, whatever it is, the thing that you put, yeah, that thing. And then she's got all her clobber, right? And the Hebrew woman is going to walk in and say, "Oh, Mom, I wonder if you could help me. Could you please hand over to me now your entire contents of your jewelry box, your necklaces, all those, actually, do you know what? Can I have those other earrings as well?" Yeah. "And then of your clothes, I'm not too fussed about that lot, never really like those. These ones, though, I really like. The nice stuff, can I have that? Like the evening gown? Yeah, all that. Can I have all that as well?" And then Mrs. Egyptian's going to say, "Oh, yes, absolutely. No problem at all. Only too happy to help." So she literally takes off her jewelry, puts it all together, gets all her stuff, hands it over, and then Mrs. Hebrew slave just walks off and never comes back with all her stuff. I mean, is that really what's going to happen? Meanwhile, Mr. Hebrew slave goes up to his boss, Mr. Egyptian, and says, "Boss, you know how you've been like consolidating your wealth, into those gold bars that, you've got them down at the bank? Could you, I don't know if you're free at the moment, could you come down with me now, just punch in your combination, and then could you give them to me? And I'll just walk off with them and never come back." "Oh, yes, I'll be only too happy to help. Oh, I'm so glad you've asked. Let's go down to the bank, punch in your combination, gold bars. There we are. Cheers, thanks a lot." And walks off, never comes back. I mean, really? Is that really what's going to happen? It must have been even harder for these people to believe that it would really happen, because these Hebrew slaves had had so much adversity, such a tough time, such a difficult experience of feeling undervalued and underpaid, under-rewarded. I don't know if you've ever had a job where you felt undervalued and underpaid. I can tell you a funny story about the first job I ever had, first paid work I ever had. It was when I was 11 years old. My parents sat me down and said, "Well, Adrian, so far you've been able to benefit from our generosity and live at home without contributing financially to the pot, but it's time for you at the age of 11 to start chipping in." Oh no, what's this going to be? "So we'd like you to get a paper round." Oh no! I was sort of, usual adolescent complaints. But then, of course, I've got to do this jolly paper round, so I turn up, and they explain how many hundreds of papers, local free newspaper, local free weekly newspaper, how many hundreds of papers I have to deliver. So when they've explained how many it is, and I remember being shocked at how high the number was, I said, "Well, how much am I going to get?" £2, 12p. I've never forgotten when he said that. £2. Is that all? I mean, hours of my time. So initially what I do is I put them only half through. Excuse me. Put the papers only half through. Then what I start doing is I'll do every other house. Because then if I do every other house, first of all, it's going to be quicker. And then I might get away with it. Because what will happen is if you don't get your free paper, by the following day you think, "Oh, hang on a minute. Free newspaper hasn't come. That's a bit weird." Knock on next door. "Did you get your free newspaper this week?" "Oh, yeah, we got ours." "Oh." Knock on the other. "Did you get your free newspaper this week?" "Oh, yeah, we got ours." "Oh, must be me then. Maybe my husband threw it away," or something like that. That's how I thought I'd get away with it. So that was my plan. Second week, I'm getting more and more and more hacked off about this. £2.12p. Third week, this is absolute truth. I take all of them down to the railway line. Yeah? Gasps. And I'm giving it, chuck them over. All of them. Yeah. I wasn't a Christian at this point. I'm just telling you a story from my past. There are other stories that are worse that I won't share with you. So I'm just like, chucking them over. Now, the next day, I have to confess to you, I did actually start to feel guilty about what I'd done with the papers. So I thought, oh, what's this new emotion? What's this new feeling? Guilt. Oh, haven't felt this before. So I went back to the railway line, and there's a few things that I discovered when I went back to the railway line. I'm not actually sure that I was really going to get them and redeliver them all, but I just felt guilty, so I just went back. When I got back, and I looked, like in the daylight, because it was in the night time, because obviously I'd done it in the night when no one could see. When I went back in the daylight, I thought, well, that fence is quite high. And I noticed at the top of the fence says barbed wire. I thought, well, that could be a problem. You know, if I'm going to try and get over this fence, that barbed wire could be an issue. Then I noticed something I couldn't see in the dark the night before. There was a big sign, British Rail, keep out, trespassers will be prosecuted. I thought, oh, that could be an issue. You know, being prosecuted, that's probably a bad thing. But the biggest thing that I hadn't factored into my thinking was overnight rain. Yeah, it had been hammering down all night. There's all my papers. They're absolutely soaking wet. So even if I had been able to ignore the sign, scale the fence, climb over the barbed wire, get the papers back up, I still would have been found out because all the papers, when they were eventually delivered, would have been soaking wet. I was so fed up. £2.12p for all this hard work. But that's nothing compared to how fed up these Hebrews must have been. I mean, think about it. This went on for decades. So maybe initially, Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew slave are looking at Mr. and Mrs. Egyptian. They're kind of averagely wealthy, Mr. and Mrs. Egyptian. But as the years go by, Mrs. Hebrew slave sees that each year, Mrs. Egyptian's got a new gold necklace, some lovely silver rings. And she's given it the earrings, and she's got more and more stuff, and clothes are nicer and nicer. By a few decades go by, this woman's thinking, Mrs. Hebrew slave's thinking, I'm doing all this back-breakingly hard labor. I'm working myself to the bone. Why? So that this other woman can get more stuff. All my labor just results in more bling for her. I mean, how unfair is that? It's like makes my life feel so pointless, so trivial. And as she's complaining, her husband says to her, do you know, I know exactly how you feel. Because back when we started working for this Egyptian couple, the boss, he was all right. He was like Mr. Average. But every decade I've been slaving for him. He's getting more and more stuff. And now he's coming down to the building site each morning with these huge gold chains, like a gangster rapper kind of. You can hear him chinking along as he's coming to the building site. And we're like, oh, no, you know, he's got all this stuff, all these big rings, big chains, all this gold. Now, just imagine that 50 years, this is all happening maybe 50 years before Exodus chapter 3. And as Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew slave are complaining about their lot in life as slaves in Egypt, imagine they hear this sound. That's the signal. For all the Hebrew slaves to come out of their quarters, they have to line the streets because somebody from the palace is coming. They have to stand there. They're not even allowed to look up. They have to keep their heads bowed as they're all standing there like obedient slaves. They don't know whether it's going to be the Pharaoh himself or maybe the Pharaoh's wife, the queen. Maybe it's going to be the princess. They don't know who it's going to be. They have to all stand there. And then the cry comes out, all hail, Prince Moses. Hail, the Prince of Egypt. It's Moses. And so he goes past in his chariot, thundering hooves. Off he goes, disappears into the distance, and he's gone. And then all the Hebrew slaves kind of slope back into their quarters. And Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew slaves say, you know, it must be lovely for Prince Moses. You know, if ever there was someone born with a silver spoon in his mouth, I mean, he gets up in the morning, he probably has this wonderful, lovely, comfy bed, and then he comes to, oh, how would you like your eggs done this morning, sir? Oh, I don't know, maybe, and then he's got a choice of stuff for breakfast, and then it's maybe an hour of tuition in poetry or literature, and then he's out maybe for a swim for an hour in the lovely pool, and then he's got a wonderful big slap-up lunch. What would you like this afternoon, sir? And then all afternoon, he's out on the sports field, playing these different games, chariot racing, whatever it is that these princes do. Lovely big slap-up meal in the evening. Then some gala event up in town in Memphis or Thebes or somewhere. What a life Moses must have, they might have said to each other. Now, I want you to imagine now that you get into a time travel capsule and you leave the village hotel in 2021, and you time travel all the way back to 1310 BC, to Egypt, and you enter that room where Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew slave are having that conversation. They're complaining about everything that's happened. And you turn up and you say, oh, hi, I've got some good news. It's all going to turn out all right in the end. And they say, what do you mean? You say, well, I just want to tell you 3 things. I think all 3 will be of interest to you. The first thing I want to share with you, you say to the Hebrew slave couple, is you're going to ask Mr. and Mrs. Egyptian for all their gold, all their silver, and all their fine clothes, and they're just going to hand them over, and you're just going to walk off with them and never come back. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to share with you that I thought might interest you is Prince Moses. He's adopted. Yeah, who knew? He's adopted. He's not even Egyptian. He's one of you lot. He's a Hebrew, and he will eventually lead the entire, you and all your Hebrew friends and relatives, the whole nation, he will lead them all out of slavery, out of Egypt, to never be slaves again. And the third thing I thought I'd mention to you is that once you've left your slave life and you're heading towards the promised land and you hit the Red Sea, yeah, massive sea, what's going to happen then is you're going to be led during the daytime by a pillar of cloud and in the night by a pillar of fire. And then when you get to the Red Sea, Moses is going to hold up a stick, and as he holds up his staff, God's going to blow back the waves on the right and the left, and you are going to walk all the way through the Red Sea as on dry ground. This is what you say to the Hebrew slave couple. And they say, look, even if we believed you, all that would happen was that we'd be dead. You say, why is that? Because you may not realize this living in Britain in 2021, but if you lived here, you would know that the other side of the Red Sea is an absolutely enormous desert where there's no food and no water, so we'd all be dead within a few days. And you say, it's funny you should mention that, you say. Because what's going to happen once you get through the Red Sea is that bread is going to fall from the sky. Yeah? Manna, the bread of heaven. This is going to turn out to be the anthem of the Welsh national rugby team. Okay? Well, maybe you wouldn't share that information. It's hard to understand for medieval Egyptians. But anyway. And then, what's going to happen after that is that meat is going to fall from the sky too. Quail is going to fall from the sky. And then in terms of the water, and what's going to happen is Moses is going to take that very same stick, the staff, strike a rock. Water is going to gush out of the rock. That's how you're going to drink. That's how you're going to stay alive. Folks, this is the reality of what actually happened. And what's even more wonderful to consider is that that very same gold that was around the neck of Mrs. Egyptian slave driver and around the neck of Mr. Egyptian slave driver, that very same gold was redeemed for a wonderful purpose. It was the same gold that was used to create the objects of worship in the tabernacle where the Israelites worshiped God in the desert in Exodus chapter 35. If you had walked in, if you had been a priest, you would have walked into this tent in the wilderness where they worship God, and you would have seen in the holy place on your left a gold menorah, a gold lampstand made out of the bling from the Egyptian slave owners that's been turned into a candlestick. And then over here on the right-hand side is the table of showbread. It's got 12 loaves on it. These are the loaves that represent the Passover, unleavened bread, made out of gold, same gold. And then in the middle is the altar of incense, where the priest would put down that tss, and then all the incense goes up and it all smells amazing. Okay, that's all the worship. Again, same gold. And then if you were the high priest, or the high priest who once a year would go beyond the Holy, into the Holy of Holies, there is more gold, more of the Egyptian gold from Mr. and Mrs. Egyptian, this time coating the poles of the Ark of the Covenant and the actual box. And inside the box are the 10 Commandments, Aaron's staff that budded, and a jar of the bread of heaven. That's what God can do with your adversity and with my adversity. That's what God really did with that ill-gotten gain. With the slave labor, God used it for good. He turned it into an object of worship. It's hard to believe that that's really what happened, but it is what happened to that gold. It's an amazing, amazing thing that God did. And folks, ever since then, God has been doing the same thing. Let's look at a few examples. George Whitefield had a huge disadvantage in life, and that is that he had a very pronounced squint. He was called Dr. Squintum. And this guy would never have been voted most likely person to be the most famous man in England and in America at the same time. You would never have voted for George Whitefield to become a public figure, but what happened was that he became a Christian at Oxford University, and by the age of 21, he was the most famous man in England because he had the most amazing ability to present the good news about Jesus. And thousands of people, 20, 30,000 people would come and listen to Whitefield preach. Now, yes, it was the message that people came to hear, the message about Jesus, but there were two things about the delivery that made Whitefield unique. First of all, his speaking voice. He was able to speak to 20 or 30,000 people with no microphone. It was said of Whitefield that he was able to make grown men weep simply by saying the word Mesopotamia. But the other thing about him was there was something about the squint. There was something about the cross-eyedness. There was something about Whitefield's face as he spoke that drew people in so that his nickname was the Seraph. People really thought he was like an angel as he spoke. It's amazing voice, this compelling face. You couldn't see which eye was looking at you, so you kind of drew in like this. And it was this amazing experience. That's how God used Whitefield's squint for his glory. It's the gold, the Egyptian gold, being redeemed for a wonderful purpose. Same sort of thing with John Wesley, his contemporary. Wesley was born into what you and I would think was an incredibly strict home. His mother, Susanna Wesley, forbade John Wesley from crying. He wasn't allowed to cry. Now, there were some mitigating circumstances. Susanna Wesley had 19 children, of whom John was number 15 in the batting order. So if you've got 19 kids, you can have some rules, yeah? Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. So there's some rules. But you know what? Wesley and Whitefield inherited a problem that we would love to have. In the 18th century, so many thousands of British people were becoming Christians that they genuinely did not know what to do with them. So many thousands becoming Christians in these huge mass meetings. This is where the discipline comes in. John Wesley used that strict, disciplined upbringing to organize them into little societies, small groups. He applied a discipline to the rule. This is why it was called Methodism, because they had methods and ways of discipling people in these small groups. God used that strict upbringing, you're not allowed to cry, turned it around for his glory. Amanda Smith would never have been predicted to become the first ever international female evangelist. Why? Because she had some significant disadvantages. She was born a slave. She was born in slavery, and actually 4 of her 5 children died. 2 of her husbands died. She had all kinds of adversity in life. But she preached the gospel all over America. She preached the gospel in Britain. She preached the gospel in Africa. She went all over the world as a traveling itinerant evangelist, and she preached in camp meetings, in holiness camp meetings, in revival meetings, and she saw thousands of people converted. D.L. Moody had a significant disadvantage in life, and that is that he couldn't read and he couldn't write. But when he was 17 years old, and every time I hear this story, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When he was 17 years old, there he was in the shoe shop in Boston, and he's putting the shoes away in the boxes. And as he's putting those shoes in the boxes, Edward Kimball is standing behind him. And Edward Kimball is talking to Moody about his soul. Where will you spend eternity, Dwight? Where will you spend eternity? What about the love of Jesus? He's sharing the good news about Jesus with D.L. Moody. As D.L. Moody doesn't even turn around, he's just listening to what Kimball's saying as he's putting the shoes away. And as he's hearing all this good stuff about Jesus, Moody's converted there in the shoe store. And D.L. Moody became the greatest evangelist on both sides of the Atlantic in the 19th century. Moody's gift was his ability to talk in the vernacular, in common speech. Not the prim and proper English that may have gone through the official channels. Moody could speak to the regular man, the regular woman, in their own vernacular. He had the gift of the gab. He was able to communicate to the very thing that you would do if you couldn't read and write. You just talk like normal people talk. That's how God used Moody. Amazing. That's how God redeemed that what could have been a disadvantage in life. William J. Seymour had a big disadvantage in life. When he was a waiter in a hotel in Indianapolis, he got smallpox that was so bad he went blind in one eye. Now, he already had some disadvantages in life. He was born to a slave father, and American slaves in the South didn't have surnames, that he just had a first name, so his dad's name was Simon. Upon emancipation, they didn't have a surname for him, so they called him Simon Simon. That was his dad's name, Simon Simon. William Seymour was the son of Simon Simon. But when he became a Christian, he went to lead a mission, an apostolic mission, in a rundown storefront shack in a place called Azusa Street in Los Angeles. And he started to have what at the time were revolutionary meetings. They were interracial, blacks and whites all together, tiny little meetings. That place, 1906 Azusa Street, was the birth of the modern Pentecostal movement. The modern Pentecostal church movement is the most successful evangelistic movement of all time. More people have become Christians through the modern Pentecostal church movement than anything else in the whole of human history. And it all began with this guy who could only see out of one eye, who was born in slavery. He was such a humble man that as this revival was happening all around him in Azusa Street, he would literally stick his head in a box. There was a box at the front behind the pulpit. He would put his head in the box because people came to see, who's the guy that leads this? Where's Seymour? And he didn't want people to look at him during the meetings because he wanted the focus to be on Jesus. He stuck his head in a box. He stuck his head in a box because that was what sort of person. That's why God used him. Do you see? That's why God used him, because he was available, because he wasn't full of himself. He was full of Jesus. Gladys Aylward, she was a parlour maid in North London. She was a Cockney. She was 4'10", and she was in domestic service. And she got invited along to a meeting in a tin hut where she heard the gospel. She became a Christian. And shortly afterwards, she felt called to be a missionary in China. So she goes for the interview with the missions board. And they say, "What do you do, dear?" "Oh, I'm a parlour maid." "You're a parlour maid?" "Ah," they say. "Gladys, the Chinese language is really quite difficult to learn. I mean, all these sort of funny characters and so on. We don't think, Gladys, you'll be able to manage. So I'm sorry, but it's a no." They turned her down. Do you know what she did? She goes down the train station, gets a train from London to Paris, gets another train from Paris to Moscow. Blow me down, she gets on the Trans-Siberian Express, all the way from Moscow over to Vladivostok. Gladys Aylward. She goes from Vladivostok into China and becomes one of the most famous missionaries to China of all time. She did it through, first of all, she had a hotel where all these guests would come and she just shared the gospel with them all. Then the Chinese government changed the rules about foot binding. They used to bind the feet of children to keep them small. They said, "We're not going to do that anymore." They paid Gladys Aylward to go all over China to make sure that that was being enforced. She thought, great, so she just shared the gospel with everyone all over the place. Then the Japanese invaded in 1937, and she gets all these orphans, and she managed to rescue them from the Japanese army by bringing them over this mountain. It was such an amazing story that it turned into a Hollywood film, and Gladys Aylward was played in the film by Ingrid Bergman. Gladys Aylward, in old age, complained that they'd chosen this tall Swedish actress, this Hollywood superstar, who doesn't really look like me, she said. Gladys Aylward, here's the kicker, became fluent in Chinese. The whole reason why she was able to do all this stuff and win all these thousands of people to Christ in China is because she became fluent in the language. The very thing that they said that she wouldn't be able to do, well, because you're a parlour maid. It's all quite complicated, this language stuff. But God used that for his glory. It was the Chinese language that he used. Chuck Colson lost it all. He was a top-shot lawyer, special counsel to President Nixon. He lost it all. Why? Because he lied and cheated. He was one of Nixon's cronies. He ended up in prison in the Watergate scandal. His reputation, his law firm, his business, everything went down the tubes. He's just an inmate. But in midlife, Chuck Colson had first-hand experience of what it's really like to be in the US penal system. He saw it from the inside. He became a Christian shortly before he was convicted in Watergate. Therefore, when he was released in the mid-70s, he gave the rest of his life to prison fellowship. That's what he called his ministry, and caused thousands of people in the US penal system to hear the good news about Jesus. Lastly, Steve Hill. Steve Hill had a big disadvantage in life. He was a drug addict. And one day his mum came home to find her son Steve passed out on his back with all of his other mates. So she walks in the living room. There's Steve Hill, her son, and all of his mates. They're all passed out. They're all lying on their backs. Why are they lying on their backs? Because as she looks up, the whole of the living room ceiling is covered with syringes. Because what they did was they injected themselves, and then for a laugh, they chucked the syringes up to see if they'd stick in the ceiling. So that all these syringes in the ceiling, there's her son, and all his mates passed out on the living room floor. Can you imagine coming home to that? So she comes home to that. Actually, it's a serious overdose. And there's Steve Hill. He's about to die. So she gets a Lutheran vicar to come. And this Lutheran vicar starts to share the good news about Jesus with Steve Hill. He doesn't even know if Steve Hill can hear anything that's being said. But as he says the word Jesus, Steve Hill begins to take it all in. Eventually he's converted, and he gives the rest of his life to serving other drug addicts through a ministry started by David Wilkerson called Teen Challenge. And then, in 1995, Steve Hill is a visiting speaker at Brownsville Assembly of God in Pensacola, Florida. And on that day, there's the most amazing outpouring of the Holy Spirit. The most amazing revival starts. Thousands and thousands of people, not just from around Florida, but all over the world, come to Pensacola. And Steve Hill is at the center of that, preaching the gospel every single night, particularly speaking to people from a drug addiction background. The very thing that could have disqualified him was the thing that God used. I wonder if the band would like to come and join me. And as they do, I wonder, finally, where you're at. The next verse in our story is a question, where God asked Moses, "What have you got in your hand?" Moses, at this point in the conversation, wasn't expecting to be asked this and was holding a staff, a stick, because he was a shepherd, yeah? So he has a staff. And God used that stick to part the Red Sea. God used that stick to cause water to come out of the rock. God used that stick to be the instrument of liberation that caused thousands and thousands of people to leave slavery and go into the promised land. What's in your past? Maybe you had a very strict upbringing like John Wesley. Maybe you have a squint like George Whitefield. Maybe you've had some adversity in your life. Maybe you're blind in one eye like William Seymour. Maybe there's something in your past that you think could hold you back. There's gold. The gold that was produced around the necks of those Hebrew slaves is the very thing that God will use for your liberation, that God will use to make you fruitful so that you can change the world. Shall we stand together? Let's stand, shall we? Father, thank you for the fact that you can use all this stuff from our past for your glory. You can turn ashes into beauty, a spirit of despair into a garment of praise, gold jewelry into an altar of incense, gold jewelry into a menorah, a table of showbread. Thank you that the Ark of the Covenant, the very place where God and man met, the cherubim and the seraphim on the Ark of the Covenant, that very gold was the same gold that used to be around the necks of the Egyptian slave owners. Thank you, Lord, that you can use adversity and things in our past for your glory. Lord, we worship you for what you're going to do in us and through us. We thank you for your kindness in Jesus' name. Let's worship, shall we?
You're like a circle that floats around me, keeping me safe and sound. And when I fall, you've tied a rope to me.